You are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support the show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
We're sponsored this week by Decode DC, the podcast that gives you the honest look at how politics affects your life. The host of Decode DC, Jimmy Williams, you got to hear this guy. He's worked for Republicans, for Democrats, and even as a lobbyist. And he's talking about all of that experience and explaining how things really work in and outside of Washington. Decode DC is smart, surprising, and it challenges the conventional wisdom, like in this recent episodes where he gets into details about Donald Trump's might deal with his conflicts of interest. Yeah, this is going to be terrifying. There was a lot of insight in that. Obviously, we're getting into unprecedented waters here as well. Or in a recent show about what the White House is really like, as told by somebody who actually lived through it, and like their ongoing series on how politics affects the food, your food, even from salt to sugar to everything in between. That's going to be incredibly important in today's day and age. It's a great show. Check it out. I did, and I think you'll love it. That's Decode DC, available on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get podcasts.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Monday, January 30th, 2017. My name is Michael Brooks on a Michael Monday, and this is the four-time award-winning Majority Report. We're broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, Scott Atran, Director of Research and Anthropology at France's National Center for Scientific Research, and author of In Gods We Trust and Talking to the Enemy, about the rise of extremism, the dangers in cultures of fascism, and how liberal values and secular values collapse and what we need to do in order to restore them, how the elite have been asleep at the wheel, and now we're in a time of unprecedented modern crisis. Plus, demonstrations unleashed across the country as the Trump organization's Muslim ban goes into effect, even hitting green card holders until that was reversed today. Stays have been issued across the country on the ban. However, in some jurisdictions, apparently Homeland Security was ignoring the court orders. We'll get to that, as well as the White House, All Lives Mattering, Holocaust remembrance. That kind of matters, and it's not insignificant that it happens the same day as the ban. And Steve Bannon, the Svengali of the child fascist White House, in a move that scrambles the National Security Council, is now given a key role in formulating national security, getting briefings for the United States. But there were amazing uprisings in this country across the weekend. I myself spent time on Saturday at Terminal 4 at JFK. It's the most inspired I've felt since this catastrophe we have on our hands. And our Democrats, in response to an awakened public, finally starting to respond. We see some indications in California that some politicians are talking about how California can withhold federal taxes from the federal government. What if other net contributor states like New York thought about doing the same thing to stop this rabid anti-democratic extremist agenda? We'll also talk again about how the neo-Confederate nominee for Attorney General fits into all of this, and footage from protests and congresspeople being turned away at Dulles Airport from speaking to detainees, all that and much, much more in this absolute blizzard of a time we're in. We're going to get to this sound, and then we have to get to Professor Atran relatively quickly, but I do want to say, going to JFK this weekend, standing at Terminal 4, blocking the street on Terminal 4, it's just incredibly important. And there's no doubt that mass nonviolent responses to every aspect of this administration are going to be absolutely essential. And some people are going to try to sort of second guess it and say, well, you might alienate certain people if you're out on the street. And they're going to get nerdy and heady about this. This is not a time for that. In the same way that if Senate Democrats hope to retain any credibility whatsoever, they need to immediately gum up the works. They need to immediately put a brake in every way, shape, and form possible on this agenda. In the same way, frankly, that of course they should be voting against every single one of this thug administration's nominees. But if any of them vote for Jeff Sessions, they must be excommunicated from the Democratic Party. There can be absolutely no excuse about that. It was inspiring to be there. It was important to be there. And I have no doubt that being there did more to sort of promote America's brand and deter terrorism in the face of what this, orange-faced maniac and this crew of who I think we really can call genuinely neo-fascists are doing. Now, I want to talk about Tim Kaine for a second. Let's get to this sound briefly. Tim Kaine, who... Again, frankly, in his voting on cabinet members, including as Pompeo as head of the CIA, has been extraordinarily unimpressive and pathetic, part of an acquiescence caucus. But he was on Meet the Press and stepped out of Vichy Democrat mode to explain the significance of Jewish people not being recognized specifically in Holocaust remembrance from the Trump Organization. And the reason that this is so important is this is a time when symbolism is merging with policy inclination. So it happens on the same day as the ban. It happens on the same day as a sort of thuggish assertion of religious persecution. And Tim Kaine is laying this out pretty nicely on Meet the Press over the weekend.
Affect green card holders, and they're being caught up in it. It affects people on special immigrant visas like interpreters who've helped the U.S. military in foreign countries, and now their lives are at risk, and so we've given them a special status to come to this country. Who would help the United States if they knew we would abandon them when they're trying to come here? It's a religious test, as you pointed out. It imposes a different burden on Muslims than others. And the irony is not lost on me that it was issued the same day as the White House issued their Holocaust Remembrance Day proclamation that, unlike any previous administration, removed all reference to Jews. So you put a religious test on Muslims and you try to scrub reference to Jews in the Holocaust remembrance. This was horribly, horribly mishandled. And, so it's not a pause in a traditional sense.
Senator, it's a tough charge. You think it's more than a coincidence that it all happened on Friday?
I think all of these things are happening together. When you have the chief political advisor in the White House, Steve Bannon, who is connected with a news organization that traffics in white supremacy and anti-Semitism, and they put out a Holocaust statement that omits any mention of Jews. Remember, earlier administrations have done these statements. And so the first thing you do is you pull up to see what earlier statements have said. And the earlier statements, President Obama, President Bush, always talk about the Holocaust in connection with the slaughter of Jews. The final solution was about the slaughter of Jews. We have to remember this. This is what Holocaust denial is. It's either to deny that it happened, or many Holocaust deniers acknowledge, oh yeah, people were killed, but it was a lot of innocent people. Jews weren't targeted. The fact that they did that and imposed this religious test against Muslims in the executive orders on the same day, this is not a coincidence.
That is exactly right. Tim Kaine put that out perfectly. And the only thing I would add to that is you just explained the nature of what you're up against. How can you vote and in any way attempt to accommodate these people in any way, shape, or form? You seem to understand exactly who they are. Also, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel tweeted in support of a wall, compared it to Israel's own barrier, and that explains the modern nature of Israel as a far-right extremist state as well. We need to be clear about where everybody stands in today's world, and as my friend DeSosa said, all lives mattering, the Holocaust is very significant. Now I'm going to tell you about a couple of today's sponsors, and then we'll go to Professor Scott Atran. And Texture has really been a very, very helpful app in this time. Some of my favorite magazines are on it, and writers. I always mention Rolling Stone. I mean, Matt Taibbi's indispensable. You can go back to a book like The Great Derangement or his columns from before, some of us were even in college that are brilliant and explain where we're going. But there's also Fast Company. There's also Sports Illustrated, Entertainment Weekly. You can keep in touch with everything in your life on the Texture app. Magazines are more than just something that you flip through in the checkout line at the grocery store. They're informative. They're entertaining. They keep you up to date on news, social issues, and even give you the opinions and ideas of the world's best journalists and writers and leaders. And you can get them all in one app at Texture. I've already mentioned several of the ones that I read regularly and rely on Texture for. Texture has gone beyond delivering just the magazine itself. They made it easier for you to find and enjoy the article you want to read. With daily recommendations, exclusive interactive features, video, and more, Texture is searchable. You can mark what you like, check out back issues, view bonus video content, and they even curate articles and magazines just for you, which is very helpful. Or whoever you're giving Texture to this year. Why on earth would you subscribe to just a couple of magazines when you could have all the best ones on your smartphones or a tablet all the time for way less? Right now, Texture is offering my listeners a 14-day trial when you go to texture.com/majority. That's texture.com/ that's 14 days of Texture for free. 14 days of Texture for free when you go to texture.com/majority. Texture.com/majority. There's a link on our homepage. Are you hiring? And do you know where to post your jobs to find the best candidates? Posting your job in one place isn't enough to find quality candidates. If you want to find the perfect hire, you need to post your job to all the top job sites, and now you can. ZipRecruiter has over 9 million resumes you can search through on their database. You can add multiple people to your account to make it the most efficient for your team to find the best hire. With ZipRecruiter.com, you can post your job to 100-plus job sites, including social media networks like Facebook and Twitter, all with a single click. ZipRecruiter is a search engine for finding and posting jobs. Find candidates in any city or industry nationwide. Just post once and watch your qualified candidates roll into ZipRecruiter's easy-to-use interface. No juggling emails or calls to your office. Quickly screen candidates, rate them, and hire the right person fast. If you have any issues, ZipRecruiter's friendly and human support staff is ready to help you. Find out today why ZipRecruiter has been used by over 1 million businesses. As featured on Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, the New York Times, TechCrunch, and CBS, ZipRecruiter's website shows trending career fields, cities, and searches. And right now, my listeners can post a job on ZipRecruiter for free by going to ZipRecruiter.com/majority. That's ZipRecruiter.com/majority. One more time, try it for free. Go to ZipRecruiter.com/majority. Now, you're informed by Texture. You have your understanding of politics from all the podcasts you're listening to, including obviously this show, but also Decode DC. And then you have, where to post your job. So it's ZipRecruiter. Now it's time to get a sleek watch. So I'm talking to you, of course, about Movement watches. We know that it was a success when Sam gave it to his wife, and Movement Watches was a company that was started by two broke college kids who wanted to wear stylish watches but couldn't afford them, so they started their own watch company. It's kind of a little bit like the way this show was started. It built a following and, we launched and broadened out in terms of podcast, YouTube, and everything else. Movement watches start at just $95. At the department store, you're looking at $400 to $500. Movement figured out that by selling online, you're able to cut out the middleman and retail markup, providing the best price possible. Classic design, quality construction, and styled minimalism. Over 500,000 watches sold in 160 countries. And right now you can get up to 15% off with free shipping and free returns by going to mvmtwatches.com/majority. This watch is a really clean design, and you'll get a lot of compliments when you put it on. Movement Watches is the perfect gift for your Valentine. Now is the time to step up your watch game. Go to mvmtwatches.com/majority. Join the movement. We'll be right back with Scott Atran on the Majority Report. Welcome back to the Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks, and joining us now is Professor Scott Atran. He's the Director of Research in Anthropology at France's National Center of Scientific Research. He also heads, and Professor, correct me if I get this wrong, the Center for the Resolution of Intractable Conflict at Oxford University. Did I get that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes, you did.
Okay, great. Professor Atran, it's really good to have you on. I was saying in the break that I'm an admirer of your work because I think it gets to really a lot of the sort of central challenges of our time in a way that a lot of people seem to be sort of uncomfortable kind of getting there, asking questions that people don't want to ask and dealing with ambiguities that people don't want to deal with. And I think that if you explain to everybody briefly your background, being mentored by Margaret Mead and the sort of debate inside anthropology that she sort of arose from and transcended, and this sort of lineage that you fit in, it will help situate the conversation.
Well, I actually started off in mathematics, theoretical mathematics, but it was the late 1960s at Columbia University. It was a time of turmoil. And while we were busy changing the course of history, or so we thought, Margaret came up to us and said, look, you young men and women, you're doing this all wrong. You should be working with your communities. You should be working with your rabbis and your priests and your pastors and your congressmen and your communities and trying to change things that way by talking to them, explaining them, instead of just by throwing furniture out the window. So, I sort of yelled at her and said, I had a top hat and red and white and blue pants at the time, and yelling at you're crazy. And she said, well, if you want to continue this, young man, why don't you come up to the Museum of Natural History and we can continue this discussion. So I did. And she looked at me and said, by the way, do you need a job? You look like you need a job. You look like you need to eat as well, sort of like a Jewish mother. And I was sort of confused by that. And she said, well, I have to go out, and why don't you answer the phone? So you sat there, not knowing what to do. I walked into the next room, which was a room set up by physical anthropologist Harry Shapiro. It had thousands of skulls, including from the Spartacus rebellion against Rome, the survivors of the mutiny of the Bounty, and I'm doing my Yorick imitations. And then I come back, there is a phone call, and it's from Andy Warhol about the idea of maybe making a movie with her and Salvador Dali, but they'd have to appear in the nude. So she comes back, she asks...
So basically you got offered like the best job imaginable.
Imaginable.
Yes.
And I'm there in the Cava Valley Bala. It's this tower in the Museum of Natural History with Zuni effigies and Zulu spears and skulls and crazy people calling. And I said, wow, this is the job for me. And that's how I became an anthropologist.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in this room are also nodding their heads and thinking it's the job for them as well. But the other thing that I want you to sort of discuss briefly again is you made this very interesting distinction that, roughly speaking, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but that basically you had a political terrain, and all of a sudden I think questions like this are becoming, I mean, they've always been relevant, but they're maybe even more urgent with what's happening in our country at least, but also across Europe, where, on the right, you had the sort of traditional racism, pseudo-biological basis for discrimination and repression. And then you had a sort of, not really left, almost like kind of Soviet or Stalinist model of a kind of complete blank slate, which is that there's nothing that we innately come in with that couldn't be socially engineered for a certain outcome. And Margaret Mead and that sort of school you came in through was that making the point that, well, of course, the right is wrong in the sense of biological superiority of one race over another. That's ludicrous and used in a sort of fascistic element. But then at the same time, obviously, we do come in with, hormones, biology, characteristics, adaptations, and that they inform all of us, and that
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Well, remember, Mead started back in 1926. It was the beginning of the rise of the xenophobic ethno-nationalism that eventually wound up in World War II. But there had been a rising tide of the sort of Spencerian interpretation of Darwin, and of course, her mentor was Franz Boas, who was Jewish himself. And so one of the forces moving the School of Columbia to send people out in the field was to find out whether or not these interpretations, in terms of sort of racial characteristics and essentialist characteristics, were in fact correct. And of course, their efforts were corrected. But then they were wrongly interpreted after the war as being supporters of a blank slate. That is, there's no inherent dispositions or innate proclivities in human beings, and as you said, everything can be socially constructed and socially engineered. And so she was accused of that. But in fact, she was quite the opposite. She was interested, and so was Boas, in what is common to humanity, and understanding what is common to humanity allows us to understand the importance and the reality of the specific differences. And when I first went to work with her, as I said, I had a background in mathematics, and I had read Noam Chomsky's aspects of the theories of syntax. And he postulates, of course, an innate sort of language organ.
Right.
And I found it to be the most beautiful book I had read in the social sciences, because it had in a sense, the aesthetic of a classic scientific theory, and yet it explained an aspect of human beings and their minds. And so I asked her if I could bring together people who I had been debating in my own mind, people like Chomsky and Piaget and Lévi-Strauss, and the Nobel Prize winners in biology, François Jacob and Jacques Monod, who had been talking about these things, the origins of life, the origins of mind. And she said, sure, why not do it? And I said, well, what do I have to do it? She said, well, you probably have to talk to these people. So I talked to them. She paid for my transportation. She didn't write any letters or anything for me. She just said, go out and do it. And I did it. I got them all together in this abbey in the north of Paris, in Beauvais, the Abbey de Royaumont. We had this debate, and I sort of came out of that debate with my intellectual edifice shattered, mostly because I thought that Noam Chomsky's views were probably right, and what the implications of that were for the way people have been thinking about human beings, their minds, and their actions were questionable, theoretically. And I still see that. And the scientific bent, both from Mead and Chomsky, have led me to part ways with most of my anthropological colleagues who either reject science or think it noxious as a way of political power and control.
Right.
And another aspect of Mead that I found not just intriguing but laudable was when I started working for her, she was about to write her autobiography. And during World War II, many of the anthropologists in Britain were guerrilla leaders, people like Ed Leach in Burma and Jack Goody in Cyprus. And she was supplying them supplies, and I was getting requests even 30 years later to provide them underwear from Brooks Brothers and
Wow.
things like that. But as I was going through her letters and correspondences, I realized how engaged she was with the real world and with power relations in the world, and how can we manage this as anthropologists. And one of the things she did with Ruth Benedict was lobby intensely not to execute the Emperor of Japan, arguing that if we execute the Emperor of Japan, we're going to have the Japanese people see us as the killers of their society and their culture. But if we try to engage the Emperor of Japan and make him, in a sense, a constant gardener, then we have a chance to work with Japanese society and make it much more open and even eventually democratic. So that engagement with power I always found to be courageous and, as I said, praiseworthy. And I find today that the critique of power, although equally praiseworthy, has in fact led to a complete removal from engagement with power, which I find to be morally indefensible. And that's where I find the position today.
Yes, no kidding. I mean, so now we're going to sort of skip ahead, but before we get to the sort of present version of the crisis that I want to talk with you about in the United States and Western society, in this rise of I feel comfortable calling it a certain sort of neo-fascism, at the very least extreme far-rightism, there's a bridge, and this is how I first encountered your work, which is on terrorism. And it's interesting, you asked Margaret Mead how you would put this conference together, and she said, well, you need to talk to these people. And I hear that same advice in your studies of terrorism and countering violent extremism. There's a couple of different parts of this that I think are relevant to bridging with some of the situation we're in today, and maybe even some of this talk about looking at online communities that have facilitated the rise of the alt-right and the far right in the United States and Europe. And these are two kind of variables or three. I mean, one is this emphasis on actually talking with and understanding the motivations of actors versus sort of ascribing a motivation to them from a theoretical framework that isn't really, maybe it's kind of crudely quantitatively tested, but again, not really. Number two, you have had a very strong argument for sort of taking people's non-material values seriously when we talk about extremism of any kind. But this, again, isn't like this sort of new atheist reductionist crowd, which is that, yeah, these people read holy books and they take it literally, so they do bad things, but much more kind of nuanced and sensitive to what's actually happening. And then number three, and I'm just, take these as they come, I'm just going to kind of situate it. You also anticipated the failure of the response of many counterterrorism efforts to things like ISIL or Al-Qaeda in terms of either responding to it just materially, which maybe policymakers and some of us on the left might do, or in this kind of reductive sort of nerdism manner that was made popular by people like Sam Harris, which again kind of missed the deeper dynamics. And I just want you to talk about the work in the terrorism field, because I think it's actually going to pivot us really well to the elite disconnect of the crisis that's engulfing the West today from the far right.
Well, talking to the terrorists, I of course, right after 9/11, I wrote a piece for a journal called Science, in which I tried to think about what was behind some of this. So there was a theoretical background,
right,
based in part on Darwinian theory and others. But then the idea is you have to actually go out in the field and find out whether what you're saying is right or wrong, and whether talking to the people who are actually doing things can change the way you think about it. And of course, all those things were true. And I went out and I embedded myself with mujahideen groups from Sulawesi, an island between sort of Borneo and New Guinea, all the way to Morocco and in between. And in that time, I found some things that are fairly constant. Of course, the people who join these groups come from all walks of life.
Right.
In fact, they span the normal distribution. That means that there are some really bright people, really actually wonderfully generous people, and some creeps, criminals, and psychopaths. But in between, they're mostly normal people. And also what I learned was that, like the National Socialist movement or the Communist movement, any attempts to treat just the individuals is going to get you nowhere. Also, any attempt to treat ideologies is going to get you nowhere, in terms of counter-narratives, because these things are thought of as ideas that float in some space and are disembodied from the actual social conditions of real life. And they have to be embedded in the social networks. And these social networks are very peculiar. We find, for example, recruitment to Al-Qaeda didn't involve recruiters at all. It was almost all spontaneous. They were like the National Science Foundation. They would accept about 15 to 20% of people who applied to them for support. It's the fact that they were out there and they were a attractor for all the things on the dark side of globalization. And then we found that, okay, there's more recruitment among the Islamic State, of course, and the involvement of social media. But if you look at the patterns of recruitment, they're very clustered. If it was just individual recruiters and social media, it would be an almost randomized, dispersed pattern of recruitment. But it's very clustered in particular neighborhoods, in particular towns, in particular online chat rooms. I mean, you would be amazed about how many whole soccer teams go off to join the jihad, or classes in medical school who go up to set up clinics in Raqqa or Mosul. But I guess what most impressed me was the sort of spiritual dimension of human conflict that I found to be ignored by political and military leaders almost uniformly. Mm-hmm. So there were three. Most of the actual information on would-be violent extremists and actual violent extremists were possessed by the intelligence community. These are clandestine organizations that keep information clandestine, and there's no scientific controls on the information they have. And of course, partial information in dangerous situations, using it judiciously, can be very important in saving people's lives. But then academics got involved for many reasons. One, because they actually wanted to stop violence, or two, because there were large pots of money suddenly available for grants and for research. But the academics who got involved had no idea who these people were, no previous experience. And so root cause explanations became current. You know, they're doing this out of religious fervor, or they're doing this because of foreign occupation, or they're doing this because they're marginalized, or they're doing this because they're poor or uneducated. And these were hammer-seeking nails, even as more complex data came in. So I wanted to talk to these people to find out what motivates them. Now, of course, people can hide their true feelings, they can lie to you, they can bullshit you, but you know, after 40 years of living in dangerous situations, you kind of know when they're bullshitting or not. And besides, we set up actual psychological experiments which can avoid many of the pitfalls of lying and pretending and posturing, and we actually do neuroimaging of people involved in radical groups, and when we see different brain patterns which we can't fake, we know they're not faking. And what we found, especially with the foreign volunteers, locals are much different because they're much more involved in sort of traditional insurgencies and nationalist movements. But the foreign volunteers are very much motivated by two factors. One is discontent with their host populations, their ways of life, for various reasons, and their adherence to sacred values. These can be secular or religious, as when land or law becomes holy or hallowed, and they have properties that violate all the basic axioms of economics and political science. And I'll just give you a couple. One is that they're immune to material trade-offs. So most people in most cultures wouldn't sell their children, or wouldn't sell out their religion or even their country for all the money in China. Another example is that they're immune to spatial and temporal discounting. In most aspects of material life, things in the here and now are more important than things in the distant future or distant past. You know, a bird in hand is more important than two in the bush. But that's not the case with things that are sacred. Things in distant places, times, may be much more valuable than the here and now. Think of the Exodus from Egypt, or the flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, or the Second Coming, or the battlefield sentiments when you visit national monuments and battlefields. And they generate actions independent of prospects of success. It doesn't matter if you achieve what you wanted to achieve, if you've actually, say, even killed many people or one person or just yourself, or whether you've sacrificed your own lives, as Martin King or Gandhi would say, we have to, rivers of blood must flow before there's change, but it must be our blood instead of the blood of others. The important thing is you do it because you believe it's right. And these kinds of values are extraordinarily powerful when they're merged with another aspect that's sort of independent, and that's fusion with a social group, a sense of complete immersion in a collective identity. We have multiple identities, most of us.
Right.
We can be Americans, we can be French, we can be journalists, we can be academics, we can be Manchester United supporters or Ravens supporters. But when you fuse into a unique collective identity, almost as in pre-literate tribes, where that is the fount of all of what you believe you are, then that fused with a set of sacred values that define that group makes it the most formidable fighting force available. So what we did was, I mean, as you mentioned, I talked to terrorists among in many cultures, but in September 2014, President Obama came out with a statement supporting his national intelligence director, James Clapper, saying the greatest mistake we made was in underestimating the Islamic State and overestimating the Iraqi army. And then they went on to say that's because will to fight is imponderable. And I think it's only imponderable if that apparent enigma arises only from disregarding the spiritual dimension of human conflict. So we went, for example, to the battlefield, the first battle in the current offensive to retake Mosul, and we talked to captured ISIS fighters. We talked in Syria to al-Qaeda fighters who weren't captured. We talked to Peshmerga, Kurdish Peshmerga. We talked to the PKK, who were the only ones that really successfully resisted ISIS in the beginning. We talked to the
national sacred identity. Yeah.
Yes. And we did experiments with them. And we found that those who were willing to fight and die most were committed to their values, and that they were willing to sacrifice their families for those values, which is very important. It's the condition for the construction of all large-scale societies. It's the very definition of Islam, submission of the family and the tribe to a larger polity, but it's also the founding myth of all the Abrahamic religions, of Abraham sacrificing his most beloved son for a greater cause, if necessary. But we find it for people bound to secular ideas as well. And people who are devoted actors behave much differently than rational actors. And the ways you have to approach them in negotiations and seemingly intractable conflicts is very different than the sorts of business-like negotiations that most people learn in the diplomatic corps or in business schools or in economics or in political science courses.
So taking it to the sort of, I keep kind of hinting at the crisis we're in, and I think I just will say, even just personally, I mean, I was at JFK over the weekend. I think people are feeling it very viscerally here in the United States. And I know this is a little different because you haven't necessarily done the same type of ethnographic research or direct research on this, but there seems to be some, because you've also said, and I think, you've covered so much there, but you've also connected, obviously, if we have a massive military response that, kills a lot of civilians, that's not necessarily helpful. As an example, social conditions can feed these other types of alienations you're talking about, racism, xenophobia, all the rest of it. And this sort of general kind of, certain malaise or purposelessness. Like I saw you give a talk once where you said, this notion of counteracting terrorism with moderate religion is like when was the last time a young person was interested in moderate anything? Like, it's a kind of basic, foolish brand proposition. And now we see this rise in America of at least a fraction or a part. And it's relevant because through this Steve Bannon character, it actually is represented at the highest levels of power in our government. But these communities online, and I think we could kind of, basically structure sort of three different positions of just, if we took it to the United States, of the kind of Trump coalition. There's the sort of traditional Republican voters who mainly showed up and voted for him, and they did for the reasons that they typically do vote Republican. And I do think some of those have always been to some degree about misogyny, xenophobia, or some sense of deeper religious values or exclusion. Then there probably were some people like Bill Fletcher Jr., who was a guy I spoke with recently, very smart political analyst. He said, right-wing populism is the herpes of capitalism, so that when you have this sort of incredible inequality, this sort of complacency of elites, which we'll get to in a moment, this is when you have an opening for proto-fascism. And you're seeing, and in some ways, I would argue that, the kind of crushing of the left in the Middle East, and it's different in terms of how it's done, but wherever the left is crushed, you have the right, you have conspiracy theory cultures, and you have bigotry that's facilitated. But then we have this online communities of alt-right people and this sort of racism, bigotry, misogyny. But what occurred to me in reading about this, and there was a piece by Abby Wilkinson that came out shortly in The Guardian, shortly after the election, which we said we need to talk about the online radicalization of young white men. And she talked about her time on these forums and we joke a lot on this show about this cuck terminology, and this sort of ecosystem that spans from kind of like personal fears of basically like social and sexual inadequacy that expand out to racial conspiracy theories and very anti-Muslim sentiment that kind of congeals and expands to basically a kind of psychographic of a Trump voter. And what occurred to me reading it was that in some ways, in this very sick and kind of unintentionally comic way, these forums are also starting to provide, without the physical risk, obviously, and I think in some ways with, and more analogous to a doctor or a engineer who might go off and join a terrorist group, because these people are probably mostly pretty physically, financially comfortable. But the same kind of sense of story and structure and purpose that you say is sort of the kind of cultural side of the inequalities that we're facing in Western societies.
Yeah, people talk about a clash of civilizations. It's precisely the opposite. There is a crash of traditional territorial cultures and a frittering of traditional identities, including the United States. If you look at the community structure of the United States, just as Robert Putnam described it in Bowling Alone, people don't go out bowling together. There are no more Rotary clubs. The community life of the United States has basically frittered away, that which made it so that everybody in the United States felt they had a visceral relationship almost with everyone else, almost as it was growing, that they could understand the other stories, except for, of course, the slave, as their story. That has gone away. That no longer exists, and to a large extent. And it's also true, basically, of the entire world order, at least since World War I and II. So we have a structural problem in the international order that's pretty deep and profound, and it's very similar to what happened in the long peace between the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars in World War I. It was a free-for-all. It was a zero-sum game. We are a predatory and self and competitive species, and the nations of Europe and the rest of the world were in that mode. And then the bloodletting, the mass bloodletting unleashed by the French Revolution, which was sort of monotheism brought down to earth that tried to save the world, but also created mass murder on a huge scale, the elites of Europe decided they couldn't handle this anymore, and they came to a sort of international consensus. And a relative peace endured until various cultures and nations started breaking the rules. They forgot what the horrors of the war were like. The values became tired, and countries started, like Russia in the Balkans or Italy seizing parts of North Africa from the Ottoman Empire, broke the rules of this international consensus, and it rapidly cascaded down. I mean, if you look at globalization, for example, capital flows in 1920 weren't achieved again till the 1990s in terms of freedom. There was globalization of railroads and telegraphs, and the only countries that had passports at the time were Turkey and Russia. And that whole system collapsed into a spiral of violence and cruelty and barbarity such as the world had never seen. And then it was reconstituted, a sort of consensual order by the victors of World War II. And what we're seeing now is something like a tiredness of the values. You know, we do studies where we can't find young people willing to sacrifice for their values, except for people willing to do so for things like the Islamic State, which is the most dynamic countercultural movement since World War II, bringing in young people, mostly young people, from over 100 countries. But the great threat, the key existential issue for all our democracies and open societies isn't from violent extremists per se. It's from the vitality of our own values. Mm-hmm. And in this fragility of our own values, we're seeing those groups with strong values tearing apart, especially the middle class, the mainstay of democracy, much as the fascists and the communists did in the 1920s, 1930s. And they are the most vibrant movements in the world today, and to tell you the truth, in the United States. In the current administration, there's a rising, stark current of the xenophobic nationalist right that's gaining strength in the United States. So the narratives, as you call them, the stories, the sense of identity, the attempt to recover in both cases the jihadi revolution, because it's a classical revolution, and the rise of the xenophobic ethno-nationalist right, this recovery of extreme nationalism as the answer to a failed globalization or a frittering globalization or a globalization that left so many out in the lurch, is the big conflict we face.
But they're also synchronized because they feed each other. I mean, they're
yes,
in a
they
symbiotic,
Absolutely.
sick, dangerous relationship. And it reminds me, you know, there was a book that came out in the 1990s that, you know, there was Jihad versus McWorld. And that argument was basically that we have a version of globalization which first of all produces massive inequalities and byproducts that none of the elite want to address, from, you know, the environment and everything else. And so it's innate problems.
True.
Right. And then it also provides no purpose other than you have McDonald's now. And then that book, Jihad, wasn't just, you know, Islam. That was, you know, this was in the 90s. So I mean, I didn't know, but, you know, I don't know how old I was. I was like 9 or something when that book came out. But, like, you know, the Balkans, Serbia, different, groups fighting in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that all of these groups represented the far-right violent backlash. And now we're seeing those parties and those, you know, that viewpoint represented in the highest levels of power in the United States. And do you think, though, when you see people out protesting at JFK as an example, or, you know, the sort of liberal elite consensus might still be asleep at the wheel? And you had some notes from Davos you sent me. I'd love you to speak on. But do you think that in the process of these things that we have taken so for granted being threatened, that people who actually do value these things, their compass might readjust as well in terms of holding these values up in a more powerful way?
Well, that's the hope. You know, here I'm right now in King's College in London with a group of rabbis and priests and pastors and academics, basically trying to figure out how, in fact, to rally people against these tendencies. And I don't see it in the liberal left, of which I have always been a part as well. The Democratic Party, I think, was completely divorced from the people that it was meant to represent, at least those who I talked to in the Rust Belt, in places like Warren, Ohio, where I was just before the election, where the General Motors plant had closed and the Hewlett-Packard plant had closed, and these people who had once lived fairly good community lives were left in the lurch, and their houses were being just put up for sale, these beautiful houses for nothing, for $5,000, because they couldn't afford to keep up the mortgage. And no one was talking to them,
Right.
except this other current, which really didn't care much about them, but at least was talking to them. And that they were in a sense seeking any hook that could give them hope, because hope is a tremendous motivator of political action. And what do I see? You know, in Davos, when I was in Davos, it's about a week ago, 10 days ago, I was listening to President Xi of China, and basically his speech was, okay, I'm the big boy on the block now, the grown-up. Forget about these others, crazies. Globalization is an ineluctable process. It can't be stopped. These populist wave is just a temporary hiccup. But you have to follow our way. We know how to do redistribution better.
Right.
We can have more equality among the nations, and everything will come out hunky-dory. And then I heard John Kerry say, well, this is just a temporary hiccup. This is all going to be over in about 3 years. Lagarde, the president of the IMF, saying pretty much the same thing. And billionaires who were sitting on my left and right were saying, well, we have to do something because none of us predicted this, and they were willing to do absolutely nothing to change their behavior, except to say, well, these people who are causing these problems are supported by masses, and perhaps we have to give them something like a universal income, which they talked about for the first time. And I'm going, are you kidding me? I mean, revolutionaries poor people aren't revolutionaries. The people who are revolutionaries are people who have some minimum sustenance where they don't have to worry about what's going into their belly, but they have nothing for their mind or their soul. Mm-hmm. So they have no purpose and significance, and they need to find it. And what you're basically saying is that you're going to give the revolution a chance. And I said, well, maybe that actually would be the best thing, because you guys are so out of touch with what the rest of the world is that maybe such a revolution is necessary, because the asymmetry of income has come back to the Gilded Age of the 19th century, and the level of discontent in the United States, just to give you an example, you'd have to go back to the 1850s to find that. So giving people no sense of purpose or no significance, but giving them means to act would be, of course, a very dangerous thing, but perhaps a very exciting thing.
Yeah, so that I love, though, that you've positioned that dual crisis, because I do think, and speaking as a more in the sort of millennial cohort with college debt and everything else, like, there is a part of what's happening in the United States that is all about income, and it's all about inequality, and it's all about structural disadvantages. But then there's also the subtext message, which is another thing that the neo-fascist, populist, far-right impulse can speak to, which is like, when you go to people and you say to somebody in, Ohio, like, all right, well, you're not going to be employed anymore, and that's going to hit your income and your dignity and your ability to survive. But even if you sort of relatively-ish land on your feet, the subtext is we're still telling you that you're too stupid and worthless in the new world. Like, you don't have anything of value in the app age. You don't have anything to say at Davos. So we're really not interested in you, and maybe we'll throw you a couple of bucks. I mean, so as a final question, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's true. But look at what the left is saying. You know, the idea that we can all get along and that we can all rise up together and we can all help one another. This is pie in the sky when you have to live in the real world. You know, one thing I found, for example, about the Islamic State volunteers, I said it's a classical revolution. So it was started by intellectuals and fairly well-educated people. In fact, all of these terrorist groups were started by people who usually had science education, like medicine and engineering. And then it appeals to masses of people, some marginalized, some poor, some frustrated in their aspirations. And then they go into building a revolutionary society, and that's why they need women, so that 1 out of 3 who are joining towards the left stages of the Islamic State were women. And when I interviewed the women and asking, why are you doing this? They would say to me, because I can't find any moral principles in my society. You know, they're accused of being nihilists, but it's quite the opposite. They want red lines. They tell me a woman can't be a woman. We don't know what culture we belong to. We don't know what's right and wrong. We don't have any moral principles. We want them. We want something to be sure. We don't want so much freedom to do something. We want freedom from all these crazy choices where we can't make. And this is very serious. This actually is something that motivates people to give up their lives for. And it has to be taken seriously.
Right. So as a final thought, I mean, I know we've covered so much. I mean, do you though, if you just had to follow an instinct, is the response, and if people on our side roughly who want to preserve an open system, who want to address the enormous iniquities that define our time and also want to defend values that may come, again, from just as made up a place as any other value, but are the right ones. I would wager that. Where do we find our vitality?
Well, you're not going to find it from old geezers like me. You're going to find it in the young people who are the most creative force in the world today, and the promise of the solution rather than the problem. The issue is that no governments are allowing young people to find the solutions they need for themselves. They are clobbered, especially young men. They're a problem to be clobbered. You know, after World War II, we had the youth boom. It was the most creative force in the history of our country, perhaps in the history of the world. Now, youth are viewed as the youth bulge, as something to be controlled, to be basically, most governments would just like to shove them off the face of the earth, instead of being harnessed and channeled and guided and helped and listened to for something that could get us out of this morass. And I'm hoping that countries will get together, support things like the United Nations Resolution 2250, which is an attempt to at least give them a voice, but I'm not terribly optimistic.
Well, Professor Scott Atran, I really appreciate your time today. Professor Atran is the Director of Research and Anthropology at France's National Center for Scientific Research, and let's see if I can go 2 for 2. He also from the Center for Intractable Conflict Resolution at Oxford.
Yes, that's it.
All right.
That gives me a life. That gives me an eternal job.
Okay, Professor Atran, thank you so much. Hope to talk with you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, we are going to go to the fun half. Sorry about those blips in the call. Obviously, I don't think it's going to be a hugely fun half today. We have a lot to cover with regards to what's happened over the weekend, the Bannon going to the top, and many other things. I'll also talk briefly about being at JFK. Become a member of the Majority Report today. It's absolutely essential to preserve open society, open media. Tomorrow, 2 Dope Boys in a Podcast, our first live show that we did at Ignition One Agency is dropping. That went really well. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, justcoffee.coop, fair trade tea, tea, coffee, and chocolate. 646-257-3920, 646-257-3920. The IMs are open. We'll see you on the other half.